So I'm going to pick up, this is kind of the second part of a series that we began last week in the book of Nehemiah called From Rubble to Return. And last week I started by introducing two concepts that I want to reintroduce this week and just reiterate for some of you that were here last week as a bit of a refresher. And then also if you weren't here last week, you'll kind of catch up on this. But this idea of from rubble to return is really built on two ideas that are essential for us to understand. The idea that we talked about last week is that these two concepts have a root and a Hebrew understanding that's far deeper than what we think of when we think about ruin or rubble or even the idea of return, what that means. There was a Hebrew word that we looked at last week, and the word is hareb. Hareb is a word that literally means desolation. It means a dry place. It means a desert. Last week we said Hareb is the equivalent of the Tri-Cities in the summer. Hareb is a desolate sort of place, right, that no one really wants to be unless they have to. That's the Tri-Cities, and that's also Hareb. And we said last week that this idea is that it's a place where life is absent. It's a place where things are not the way they're intended to be. If human beings are living in that place, then those individuals, their lives are not flourishing, their lives are floundering, and they're not experiencing the kind of life that God created for them. What we talked about last week is that that's a reality that exists. But in that reality, God frequently moves. The Mount of Horeb or Mount Sinai, same root word, is the mountain where God spoke to Moses and gave him the 10 Commandments and began to create a picture of a flourishing community. Horeb is a place out of the desert where God frequently makes himself known, but not so that people would stay there, not so that people would continue to live their lives in a place of rubble and ruin. But the idea with God is consistently over and over again that they would rise out of the ruins and they would rise out of the desolation to live lives that flourish the way that individuals were created to flourish. Now, the word that's used to describe that sort of shift in a person's trajectory is a Hebrew word that we said together last week. The word is teshuvah. And teshuvah literally means to return. And there's this dynamic to the idea of teshuvah, this idea of return, that speaks to the physicality of this, that you and I, as individuals, can be moving in a direction, but teshuvah indicates that we now shift directions and we go a different way. We're moving a different way, but to return, to move in a different way, means we're going back, which should have us asking the question, well, what are we going back to? Well, what we're going back to is what God has created us to be, what God created for us. The most beautiful image that we have of that is in the Hebrew Scriptures, they open with this illustration, this beautiful picture of a garden, right, where humanity is experiencing community with their Creator, where they're experiencing human relationship the way they were intended, and there is flourishing all around. It is a garden. So we return to the garden. There is a desert, there is Horeb, and there is Teshuvah, which is this return, this movement to us becoming the people that we were intended to be. The story of Nehemiah, this book of the Bible that we're looking at in the Old Testament, is a story of ruin. It's a story of desolation, and it's a story of return. It's a story about individuals who are moving from one place to the other. And the reason that we're looking at this story, the reason that we're so compelled by this, is that anytime we see this sort of thing, it's inspiring, right? I mean, any time that you and I see individuals whose lives are floundering, there's something that's compelling to watch people be lifted out of their desperation, to be raised up out of a place of floundering, and to be brought to a place where they begin to live life as they were intended to live. There's something that's beautiful about that. And Nehemiah is this amazing story about people who were living in desolation and began to move towards what God created them for. Last week, we started looking at this by seeing some of the historical background of what was taking place in this story. The Hebrews had been conquered by the nation of Babylon, and the Babylonians had carried off the Hebrews into exile to the city of Babylon. They had desolated the city, or decimated the city of Jerusalem. They had eradicated temple worship. They destroyed the walls. They pillaged the whole city and destroyed Israel as a functioning, worshiping nation for several decades. And then Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, conquers Babylon. And then in the process of conquering Babylon, begins to discover that all of these people have been dragged from their lands. And it's actually Cyrus the Great who says, this Persian king, who tells the people of Israel, I want you to go back to the city of Jerusalem, and I want you to rebuild your city, and I want you to rebuild the temple, and I want you to flourish as the people God intended you to be. It's kind of an amazing thing to think that God was using Cyrus the Great to initiate this process of teshuvah, this return for the people of Israel. And so they did that. The people went back. Some of them went back. Some of them were still hanging out there from the exile. Some of them had hidden. And where we pick up the story with Nehemiah is 90 years down the road, 90 years after this decree. And what we're learning is that when people came to Nehemiah and he asked them about the condition of the city, the report that he gave was one of Hareb. It was one of people who were living in desolation, people who were living among the ruins. There was rubble. They were living their lives in a shadow of what they were intended to live. What we saw last week is that Nehemiah, when he hears this, even though he's not connected to the situation, even though he's not living in Jerusalem, even though he's hundreds of miles away, there was something that stirred in the heart of Nehemiah, and he said, this is not the way that it's supposed to be. This is not the way that God's people were intended to live. This is not flourishing. This is floundering, and his heart broke because he longed for this return. He longed for the teshuvah of other people. This story is a compelling story because we see a group of people moving from brokenness to wholeness, and that's an amazing thing. It's what we want. It's what we long for. When we hear reports in our culture, or we see things that are broken in our city, or we just know things that are messed up in the world around us, what we long for is to see somebody do something about this situation and get us back to where we belong. That's what we long for. So this story is compelling for that reason, but this story is also very compelling for another reason, and the reason that we're talking about it is that what Nehemiah describes and what he models for us as the way of return, what he shows us as the means by which we rise up out of the rubble, is completely contradictory to what our culture says. So our culture says, if you and I are in a place of living in the ruins, if our life is a mess, if things are broken, if we're purposeless and we're wandering and we're looking for life, our culture says we do that through self-improvement. We do that by improving ourselves. We do that by becoming better versions of ourselves, by working harder to be better people that we think we are for others. When in fact, what Nehemiah is modeling for us and what he's showing us is completely the opposite, that this teshuvah, this return, is something that isn't discovered when you and I become better people ourselves through self-improvement, but it's discovered when we become obsessed with, when we become dedicated to the improvement of other people's lives. When we actually say, no, this isn't about me, and I'm going to actually make my life about someone else, what Nehemiah models for us is that when we begin to answer the question, what breaks my heart, when we begin to think about other people's situations and consider doing something, when we begin to let things sink in, there's something that stirs inside of us, that when we get past this cultural wave that's constantly telling us that it's all about us, when we begin to hear the voice of God saying, no, it isn't, it's actually about somebody else, that is when you and I individually begin to experience the return that God has for us. When we begin to live our lives for other people. Nehemiah is showing us the way out of the rubble and into the return. His heart was broken. In the same way our hearts should be broken. What's amazing, though, is Nehemiah doesn't just stop there. Nehemiah doesn't just go, man, that is really horrible. Right? When we do this, right, like we live as spectators, and we're trained to be spectators. We look from a distance and we go, that is really bad what's going on over there. The story of Nehemiah is compelling because Nehemiah doesn't leave it there. If last week's question was, what breaks your heart? This week's question is, well, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? There's this question that just seems to rise from this story as we look at it today that just says, what are you going to do about it? That question stirs up a very specific memory for me. I was a really awkward elementary age kid. Anybody else? You with me? There's like 3 of us. Great. We'll start a new community group here at Summit. For those of us that were really awkward, and there'll be like 4 of us. Some of you are like, Brad, you're still awkward. And maybe I am, but I was really awkward in second grade. I was kind of a goofy kid, but like second grade is just kind of a chaotic time. People are trying to figure out who they are. And when I was in second grade, there was another kid who was in my grade, not in my class, but he was in my grade, and his name was Toby. Is there anyone named Toby here today? Anyone? Okay, good. Because Toby, whether it's the real Toby or any Toby, Toby's always the name of every bully, right? That's just like Toby. So Toby's this kid. I'm convinced he shaved in second grade. Like Toby. You know what I'm talking about? How many of you guys, you went to school with a kid like that? Like, he was like, do you have a beard in your second grade? Like, is that a beer in your lunchbox? Like, what is this? Like, I think Toby drove himself to school in sixth grade. Like, that was Toby. And he had this crew that hung out with him, and they were always terrorizing people. And so when I think back to second grade, Washington High School, Phoenix, Arizona, my thoughts were this: avoid Toby. Like, that was every day. Like, you go to recess, what are you going to do today? Well, we're going to play a game, but the undercurrent of whatever game we're playing is avoid Toby, avoid him. Like, we were always just like in this avoidance thing. Now, here's one of their habits. Toby and his crew, what they did, the Toby posse, one of their favorite things to do was this. Because it was Arizona and the classrooms faced outside, after lunch, we would take our lunch boxes and we would put our lunch boxes outside the door of our classroom. Toby and his friends randomly, through acts of terror, would choose a person's lunchbox seemingly every day and pull it out on the sidewalk away from the classroom. They would gather around, and then Toby, with his massive size 11 second grade foot, would smash the lunchbox. Now, back then, those of you, like after the last service, somebody explained to me that a certain generation doesn't remember lunch boxes. Right? There were these little metal boxes with a clasp, and they were very beautiful, wonderful creations of art. Sometimes you can buy a retro one today. But they would smash these lunch boxes. So kids would come back from recess, and they would just be like, oh, like, not again, right? Or like today they struck me. This one particular day, I was out on recess, and I was on top of a slide, and I looked towards my classroom door, and I realized that Toby was standing outside of my door, and something rose up inside of me. And I was like, no, you don't. Not my Dukes of Hazzard lunchbox, which is what it was. So I slide down the slide, and I just take off in a dead sprint. And as I'm running, as I'm getting closer, I can see it is. I mean, there's Bo and Luke, and they are getting ready to go down on the ground. And as I close in, his foot comes smashing down on the box, and the whole thing is just crushed along with my soul in this moment. And I looked at him, and I don't even know what I said, but whatever I said, he looked at me and goes, "What are you going to do about it?" And before the question mark was put on the sentence, my hand was already balling up into a fist. And from somewhere deep inside of this now crushed soul came the swing of a lifetime, and I jacked him so hard in the face, it just laid into him, sends him back. All of his friends, you could hear the gasp, like, "What have you just done?" And what I did was to basically like seal my fate for the rest of second grade, right? I ran and ran. I think I lost like 20 pounds in second grade because all I did was just run around, just always running. Stay away from Toby, stay away. So whenever I hear this, like, what are you going to do about it? It always brings back this memory that there's this situation, there's this thing, and somebody's got to do something. And somebody has to stand up and take a stand to whatever it is that we're facing. That's the question that Nehemiah finds himself asking, saying, there's this scenario. God's people are floundering, like society's broken, culture's just messed up. What are you going to do about it? This isn't just a, hey, my heart's broken. This isn't just a, man, it's really bad that this is going on. But the question that Nehemiah asks, and what makes him an ordinary person who does an extraordinary thing, is what are you going to do about it? What am I going to do about this? Am I going to actually step out and do something about this? And today we see that this is a very dangerous question to ask. And we see it as we look at this story. If you have a Bible, open up to Nehemiah 2. We left off in chapter 1. We'll pick up in chapter 2 this week. Nehemiah begins to act on this whole idea. In verse 1 it says, in the month of Nisan, that month they make amazing automobiles, in the month of Nisan. In the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, and by the way, some of the months, this is kind of a side note, some of the months have significance because of Jewish celebrations like Passover, when people knew they were supposed to be free and living the life God intended for them. There's some significance with what was going on in Nehemiah's rhythms of his life. But anyways, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up wine and gave it to the king. He's going to ask him a question, and then like a rule of thumb is, like, if you're asking for something, like, get him to loosen up a little, right? Give him a couple of glasses of wine. Maybe the king will be a little easier. So he goes up, he takes wine up to him, and he says, now I had not been sad in his presence. I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you're not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. And then I was very much afraid, and I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? There's this moment where he walks into the king's presence, and this idea of what's happening in the city of Jerusalem, the reality of this report that he heard, that people are floundering and not flourishing, it wrecks him so deeply that in the king's presence, he looks like you can look at him and say, man, what is going on? You know what I'm talking about? Like when somebody walks into your life and you can just tell by the look on their face, you're like, what happened to you, right? That's the situation. He walks in and his heart is broken. And it doesn't matter how good his life is, it doesn't matter how comfortable he is, he can't help but show the pain that's on his face. And so verse 4, it says, then the king said to me, well, what are you requesting? And this is huge, because you don't ask kings for things, right? Kings don't ask other people these questions. The king asks you for things. And essentially what this is in this moment is the what are you going to do about it moment. What are you going to do about it? What are you asking of me? In this moment, Nehemiah has to make a decision. My heart might be broken, but am I going to actually do something about this situation? And I love that the first thing that he does, the next verse, or the next part of verse 4, he does what all of us would do. It says, the rest of verse 4 says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. Like the king asked him, and he's like, oh, God, help me, right? And I love that because we pray those prayers, right? Like you just have this moment of like, what am I about to do? And I love this part of it. But I also love this because it just shows he's very ordinary. This is somebody who's just like us, who's getting asked a big question, and it's like, man, God, what am I about to do? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. I want you to realize what he's asking here. It's like, listen, I'd like a leave of absence. Wonder if I could get some time off. I've been accruing vacation for a while. Could I maybe take this time and go rebuild the city of Jerusalem? Which I don't know about you, but when I hear somebody say something like that, I'm like, you said what? You want to go do what? Well, I want to go rebuild the city of Jerusalem. Like, how long does that take? I don't know. I've never done it before. A couple months. Like, never rebuilt a city before. But he's just like NBD, right? Just rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And so in verse 6, it says, the king said to me, with the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone and when will you return? Kind of like me asking my daughters when they're leaving the house, right? How long are you going to be gone? How long is this going to take? And so he tells him, so it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. Then Nehemiah's feeling it. And when you're feeling it, like if you've ever walked into your boss and you've asked for something, or you walked into your parents and you asked for something and you just like sensed generosity on their part. Maybe your kids have done this to you. I know my kids have done this a time or two. It's like they just like feel like, man, Dad's in a really good mood. We should just keep going. And so then they're just like, oh, this, and then while we're at it, Dad, what about if you give me your car? Like, they do these things, right? Like, how about $1 million? Whatever, right? So he's feeling it. He's on a roll. He's asked for this. The king's like, sure, take some time. He's like, maybe this too. So he says to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah, and let a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. He's like, can I have some timber to rebuild the city and the wall, and then like a house for me? He just like keeps going. But then it says, the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. This is crazy, right? So he goes to Jerusalem. He gets the letters. In fact, King Artaxerxes says, hey, well, I want you to take some soldiers with you. So he takes some military leaders with him to this city. And there's some tension with the local leadership. We'll see a little bit of that in a minute and more in the weeks to come. But then after he's in Jerusalem a few days, in verse 12, this is what we read. So he gets there. I mean, as far as we know, we don't know that Nehemiah has ever been to Jerusalem. This is just this thing that ached inside of him. It says, then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one which I rode. By the way, this is like a spy mission, so I like this part. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring, which sounds really fun, the dragon spring, and to the dung gate, which doesn't sound very fun. And I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went out to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. And then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I'd gone or what I was doing, and I'd not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. It's this crazy scene, right? So he gets permission. He goes to Jerusalem, and now in over the cover of night, he and a couple of guys, they're riding around. They're inspecting, what's this going to take? We got to do something. What are we going to do? He's taking it all in. He's not posting on social media what he's all about. He's just I want to know what it's going to take. And then in verse 17 it says, then I said to them, and when it says to them, he's talking about the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials that he was talking about in verse 16. He says, I said to all these people, do you see the trouble that we're in? How Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Do you see this? Do you see the Horeb? Do you see the desolation? Do you see that this isn't flourishing? Do you see this? Do you recognize this? There's this very real moment on his part of saying, are you with me? Do you know what I'm talking about? Are you seeing the scenario the way I see the scenario? And then he says, come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also for the words that the king had spoken to me. And I love this, because it says, they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthen their hands for the good work. Which I hear that, strengthen their hands for the good work, and I think about those little black handle things you strengthen your grip with. Yeah, that's what I think of. They're hey, just give us a couple minutes, because we're no, I'm just kidding. Anyone that lived in the 80s, you know what I'm talking about, right? Dukes of Hazzard lunchboxes. And this is amazing, right? I mean, this story is teaching us so much. What are you going to do about it? Earlier I said this is a dangerous question. What are you going to do about it? If you're going to let your heart be broken, if you're going to hear the reports and see the things and know that stuff's messed up, and you start to actually let that sink in, if you begin to ask the question, what are you going to do about it? That's a dangerous question to start asking. Why? Well, because when you start deciding to make a difference, you're also deciding to take a risk. Making a difference means taking a risk. That's what this story's telling us. That's what Nehemiah's showing us. Saying, man, like if you want to get out of the rubble and the ruin, if you want to actually do something about this, there's some risk involved. There's some risk. Like making a difference means taking a risk. There's a saying I say every now and then, like in my house, I always say, you got to risk it for the biscuit. Anyone ever said that, right? Look at somebody next to you and say, you got to risk it for the biscuit. Come on. You got to risk it for the biscuit, right? You got to risk it for the biscuit. Like sometimes you got to risk it. Like, do you see this? Like Nehemiah isn't simply sad, right? He chooses to do something about this. Like he's going to make a risk in doing something other than the status quo. And this is true in every single aspect of my life and your life, whether this is something personal that we're going after, if it's something cultural that we're trying to address, if it's something global that we're trying to solve. Anything that moves us out of the status quo requires risk on our part. There's a risk involved. Well, what is risk all about? Why do we say there's risk? Well, risk is always about comfort, right? Risk is always about you and I being comfortable. Risk is when we've got it good, right? Like we've got things the way that we'd like things to stay. Like this is pretty easy. It's predictable. We've got things kind of figured out. We may not be flourishing, but at least this isn't chaos, right? We feel safe, right? We feel like we've kind of got things at a place where we've got some predictability about our schedule and about our lives, and maybe we don't feel like there's impending danger or things are threatening us. That's a definition of having to risk, is putting our safety on the line. There's this idea of being in control. Whenever you and I begin to relinquish control, whenever you and I begin to let loose of the control of our lives, there is risk involved. Doing something other than the status quo means taking a risk. Nehemiah is comfortable, guys. Like you look at his story, this is why it's so powerful, because his story is our story. His story is a story of somebody who worked a good job and had a good life and was doing everything his present culture around him said to do. And yet for him to do this, for him to do what he did, to be this heroic character that we now read about, he had to take a risk. He had to put his comfort and his stability and the predictability on the line. This moment, why does he pray in front of the king? Why is he standing there saying, "Oh, God, help me"? Because he knew there was risk involved, right? He's standing there, and there's this moment with the king where he says, "What do you want from me? What are you asking?" In other words, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to keep living your life for you? Are you going to keep being comfortable? Are you going to keep building your kingdom, Nehemiah? Or are you going to do something with your life? And in that moment, he felt the tension, right? He felt this anxiety that welled up inside of him, the same anxiety that wells up inside of us, right? He's going to get uncomfortable. He's going to get uncomfortable. And he acts audaciously and boldly. I think it's funny because back to that whole self-improvement thing we talked about last week. With self-improvement, we get this whole uncomfortable thing. It's really, really interesting. Like self-improvement, when someone says, "Well, man, you got to start eating better," we understand that eating better is uncomfortable. Can I get an amen? Right? When was the last time your doctor said, "You need to eat more comfort food"? Right? Like comfort food also equals heart attack, right? Like if you stay comfortable, you don't get healthier, right? We call it comfort food. And what does comfort do? Just like clogs your arteries, right? And when somebody says, "You're clogging your arteries, you got to do something," what do you have to do? You got to eat stuff that's uncomfortable, like salad. It's nowhere near as fun as chicken, is it? Right? So you get uncomfortable, and we get that. We go, "Yeah, if I got to get healthy, I guess I got to get uncomfortable," right? Same thing physically. If you want to get stronger, if you want to get faster, if you want to be more fit, and somebody says, "Well, here's what you have to do," you guarantee yourself, right? There's going to be some discomfort, right? There's nobody that's ever, you never see people at the gym who are just smiling like, "Man, this is so comfortable." Everyone looks miserable. I don't know why people join gyms. You walk into gyms, you're like, you all look like you're hurting, like you're in pain. Everyone's like, "Yeah, it's so good," right? Because we get this, right? We get that self-improvement requires like a discomfort, right? Somehow, though, when we begin to translate this to the real difference maker in our lives and in other people's lives, the idea of improving another person's life, somehow when it becomes an uncomfortability with that situation, we begin to withdraw. We begin to get nervous. We begin to feel the tension. Why? Because when we start to move that direction, we know we're about to risk, and it may cost us. When we risk, there are costs that are involved. And if you start to answer the question in your life, like, what am I doing? Like, am I doing anything besides making my life more comfortable? If you start to take that seriously and you start to think, what am I going to do about it? I guarantee this, it's going to cost you. It may cost you some time. It may be that there are things that you've got planned in your future. There's stuff that you're looking forward to enjoying, and there are going to be things that come off of your calendar because you realize, you know what? There's only so much time in a day, and I'm going to have to risk this in order to do this. There's going to be sacrifice. It's going to cost you money. It may be that you make less money because you spend more time doing other things, or it may be that the money you make, you spend on things you didn't plan on spending it. Whatever the case is, there are going to be costs that are involved with this. It may be that you just cost all of your comfort. It may be that you get really uncomfortable in your life. Whatever the case is, it's going to cost something. You're going to have to spend effort and energy. And immediately when you do that, you are going to feel the tension. In fact, some of you already feel it right now, don't you? Somebody says you're going to start living for something other than just you, and immediately you start feeling the tension. Because chances are, the decision to do something for another person that benefits them and not you moves you in a direction that you're not presently moving. Because everything in our culture moves us towards pleasing ourselves, making ourselves more comfortable, building our life. We live in a culture of self-preservation. We do that really well. We are like ultimate life preservers, right? Everything is about preserving our life. Preserve my life. Save my life, right? I want to save my time. I want to save my money. I'm just trying to protect my time. I'm trying to guard. I'm trying to put up boundaries. You know how many times I've heard people say, "Yeah, I just need some more me time." What is that? Right? So the problem with answering this question, the reason this is so dangerous, is that we risk losing what we've been told makes up our life. People tell you that your life, your value is based on your net worth. And when you start to give that up, it feels like a risk. And people tell you your freedom and how you use your time for you is who you really are. And you start to give that up and you start to think, well, I'm going to lose my identity in this, right? Or your reputation. You start hanging around people, or you start doing things or spending your time in scenarios that you didn't, and people start going, what are you doing? Why are you with that group? And you start to lose your reputation. And it's who we find our identity in. All of these things. Maybe it's just our familiarity. Maybe the familiarity of our life. We go, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be a mom and also do this thing. I don't know how to be a guy who runs a business and is involved here. I don't know how to make these two things work. Like, my culture hasn't shown me this. Whatever it is, there are going to be things that we're going to lose in the process of answering this question. You're going to feel the tension. But what did Jesus say about this? I said this last week, and I'll say it again because it is so central to the heart of what Christianity is all about. Jesus basically said, if you devote yourself to yourself, if you devote yourself, if you make your life about you, at the end of your life, all you will have is you, and it will be empty. It's just rubble. It's just desolation. It's Horeb. Jesus over and over again is saying, lay down, make the sacrifice, take up the cross, do these things, not for your sake, but for my sake and the gospel. Last week I said this, and I think it's worth saying again, that the essence of self-improvement, according to Jesus, is self-denial. We deny ourselves. And when you and I begin to walk in this direction, we're going to feel pressure. We're going to feel pressure internally. When you start to say, what am I going to do about it? Oh man, I'm going to like mess with my own world that I've been trying to build. That's normal. You're going to feel pressure from the outside. Look what happens next. The next thing in this story, you look at verse 19. Nehemiah starts to step out, starts to risk, starts to do these things. And then look at it. It says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah, the Ammonite servant, Tobiah, do you see the translation? I don't make this stuff up. I'm not kidding. I don't make this up, I promise you. Toby. Like, you start stepping out and Toby shows up. And Geshem the Arab heard it. They jeered at us and they despised us and they said, what is this thing that you're doing? That's what culture does, right? You start to step out and say, I'm going to live my life for other people. I'm going to start to risk it, right? I'm going to start to take these steps and begin to answer the questions that are nagging in my soul. And suddenly people begin to ask, what are you doing? Who do you think you are? And then Nehemiah, I love this, and we're going to look more at some of this stuff in the weeks to come. He says, then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. Here's what I want you to know. Everything in your life is pressing you to remain status quo. It is. Everything in our culture has built walls around you to try to keep you exactly where you are. We live in a society that is structured to function best when you fail to flourish. Which is why you begin to take steps of faith and risk. There begins to be tension in you and from the outside. And you find yourself asking, why am I doing this? And you hear other people going, why are you doing this? Some of you, you know this. I know some of you in the room, this is your story, right? Like, there's something that has been capturing your heart, and you've taken steps, and you begin to move down a road, and you've got friends who look at you and go, what are you doing? Like, why do you spend your time? Like, some of you retired, and you're supposed to be playing golf, and instead you're doing other stuff for other people, and everyone's going, what are you doing, right? Or maybe you got a family, and you've taken foster kids in, and, and people are going, what are you doing? Like, why would you give up your freedom? Like, you almost had the kids gone, right? Like, we do these things, right? Like, you have free time. You finally have worked to get free time, and you're volunteering. You're using your energy to serve other people. And people, why do you do that? Wouldn't you rather go out on a Friday night and do this with, like, this happens, right? You know this. You start feeling the pressure, which is why we need faith, which is why we need trust. See, making a difference means taking a risk, and taking a risk requires faith. It means that we have to trust that what we're reading in the life of Nehemiah, that this alternative narrative to the human experience, we have to trust that there is truth at the bottom of this, and that as contradictory as this seems, as inconsistent with the message our culture is sending us, with as counterintuitive as this may feel, when we begin to live this out, we begin to also experience the promise of living in truth. It's confirmed for us. We know it. We experience it. We need to trust. I remember when I was also like in second grade, I played soccer, which I really was just on a soccer team. I didn't really play soccer. I looked at the opportunity to be on a soccer field as a moment to like ponder the bigger things in life. So while other kids were playing soccer, I was just considering the universe or chasing butterflies and that kind of thing, right? So that was me, and I wasn't a good soccer player when I was a kid. And so there was this one particular game where there's this kid that just kept kicking the ball right at me. And so every time he kicked the ball at me, I just like dove out of the way because there's a ball that's flying at me. And like that's a very natural human response. And when I was a kid, people would say all the time, "Don't be afraid of the ball." And I'm like, are you kidding? Right? Like that's one of the worst things you could ever tell a kid, right? Don't be afraid of the ball. If there's an object flying at you, as a human being, our natural instinct is to get out of the way. So I always got a little angry when people say, "Don't be afraid of the ball." But this particular game, we kept losing, like they were scoring on us because I was letting the ball through, and like I was like the last line of defense, mainly because they were hoping the ball would never get to me because I was that bad. But we had this little halftime, and my dad comes over to me at halftime, and he goes, "Listen, buddy, listen, you just need to stand in there. You just need, like when that kid comes up, you just need to rush him and you need to get right there, close the gap and get right up in front of him." And I go, "Dad, if I do that, he's going to hit me in the face with the ball." And my dad goes, "Listen, I promise you, he will not hit you in the face with the ball." And so I went out just like bold, right? Kid comes running on the field. I close the gap, smack right in the face, like absolutely. And I remember, my dad still will tell you this, I looked at my dad and all that was in my head was, "You lied to me." Like, you lied, right? Like, I quit soccer that year. Any sport with a ball that came flying at me, I quit, right? I didn't play any of those. I went and swam. That's what I did. But you know what? My dad was actually right. My dad was right. My dad was right. And I've discovered that sometimes you do have to stand in there. And sometimes the ball's going to come at you. And sometimes it's going to hurt. Sometimes you're going to want to duck. But when you stand in there and you trust, that's how this game gets won. So God's stirring in our hearts. And He's stirring in our lives. And I know that you're hearing these whispers of, "I want my life to count. I want my life to matter." And I understand. I want you to understand that I know this. This story of Nehemiah reflects this. We all know there's risk involved. There is risk involved in you and I saying, "I'm going to jump out because I'm tired of the rubble and I want to see people flourish. I want to see teshuvah firsthand." There's risk involved with that. But I pray that you have the faith and the strength to trust the one who gave everything for us, so that we could give everything for others. Would you stand with me and let's pray together? Lord, I pray for courage. I pray that you would give us the ability to stand right now in those places, Lord. I know that for many of us, the idea of stepping out and using our time or our energy for other people, for answering a question of what are we going to do about it, there's just anxiety and there's fear. And I know our culture and just life itself can press down on us so much to say, what can I contribute? What can I do? And should I do? Or do I have the right to? Lord, I just pray that all of those questions and all of those fears, not that they would be completely eradicated, but that we would respond to them with trust, that we would know that doubt and faith are amazing dance partners, and that when we doubt and we question, it's an amazing, beautiful opportunity for us to rely on you. Lord, I pray that you'd put that in us, and I pray that we would be people who step out in faith because we trust you. We love you, Jesus, and we pray these things in your name. Amen.